This series is based on a true story. Police patrol the streets of the city to catch 2 escaped prisoners. Authorities have promised $100,000 to anyone who leads to the capture of the fugitives, and $50,000 each to anyone who provides any useful information. In June of 2015, the state's Chief Inspector Catherine Scott had a conversation with Joyce Mitchell, also known as Tilly, who as a former prison supervisor has big trouble, though she claims she hasn't done anything wrong. A stenographer arrived, and the conversation became official. Tilly is 51 years old, married to her husband for 21 years. Tilly is now suspected of being involved in romantic relationships with 2 inmates and helping them organize their escape. Tilly denied this, looking down at the floor and portraying herself as a victim. Catherine, trying to be as gentle as possible, advised Tilly to be honest. Catherine already knows the answers to most of the questions she asks, so lying is pointless. Some time before these events, Tilly lived with her husband Lyle Mitchell, and their dogs in a large but modest house. Their life was measured and quite boring. Every morning they woke up at 6:30 and hurried to work. It was January 2015. Both spouses work at Dannemora Prison, located in Clinton County in the northern part of New York State. Many dislike such cold winters. Tilly also dislikes it because this weather makes her feel longing. Tilly's duties include supervising the work of inmates in the prison workshop, where clothing is produced for local businesses. Among the inmates are David Sweat and Richard Matt. Tilly praises David for his good work and asks him for help in the machine room. But in fact it was just an excuse. No one should know about the secret relationship between the supervisor and the inmate. However, David doesn't keep it a secret and boasts to Richard. It seems that Tilly is very lonely in her marriage. After the shift, David, Richard and other inmates were taken back to their cells. Richard gets along well with the guard Gene Palmer and has some privileges. Besides, Richard is an excellent artist and technician, so in prison he is respected among both the staff and the inmates. Of course Richard doesn't tell anyone about David's secret, although there are rumors in prison about his affair with the supervisor. After talking to the guard, Richard approached David's cell and told him that he was acting recklessly, considering that Tilly is married and her husband works here. However, David just waved it off. Returning to his cell, Richard finished working on the painting promised to Gene Palmer. It will be a gift to his wife for their wedding anniversary. Gossip among colleagues about Tilly and David's affair is gaining momentum. But Lyle doesn't believe in all these rumors. There is a small shop in the prison where inmates can buy food and hygiene products with earned money. This time Richard didn't have enough money for shaving gel. One of the inmates, a young guy named Angel, is in prison for the first time and wants to befriend Richard. As a sign of his good intentions he gave him shaving gel. Richard explained the prison rules and regulations to Angel. Since Richard is friends with a guard from the convoy, he has privileges and facilitates other prisoners for return favors. Almost every day inmates work. There are rules on the outside and rules here. And to survive, you need to learn to be a part of this harsh world. During a break when David was trying to draw a picture, Richard explained his mistakes. Everything should follow logic, but in David's drawing, light and shadow are distributed incorrectly. Many inmates started teasing David because of his special relationship with the supervisor. Mrs. Mitchell as usual asked David to come to the workshop under some ridiculous pretext. David wasn't in the mood for it, but he had no choice. As they were alone, Tilly was persistent but David just walked away. When she and her husband were returning home, Tilly was in a bad mood and reluctantly engaged in conversation. Gene was impressed by Richard's painting. It's real art, and Gene even regrets that such talent is going to waste. However, Richard takes his situation with humor. At the prison it's time for lights out. On Saturday Lyle persuaded his wife to spend time together and go to the History Museum. They watched old movies. At one point, Lyle casually told his wife that he didn't like the fact that she was getting too close to one of the inmates. Tilly responded indifferently, saying that David Sweat helps her maintain order. As a result, the spouses quarreled because Tilly was hurt by the husband's lack of trust. However, the true reason for her distress was David's recent rejection. Tilly wants to feel desired, but Lyle does not interest her in this respect. David dreams of transferring to any prison closer to the south and called his mother hoping she could find a lawyer for him. However, the mother wasn't too eager to help the son. When David yelled at her, she hung up. The guy regretted his words, but it was too late. After the weekend, David approached Tilly and presented her with a small gift as an apology. Tilly was very touched. When they were alone, David said that last time he just wasn't in the mood. In reality he never intended to leave her. Richard closely watches David. Approaching Tilly, he hinted that he wouldn't mind having special relations with her too. Their communication made David nervous. This time Tilly was coming home in a great mood. Even her husband's grumbling couldn't spoil it. At home, Lyle was going to walk the dogs as usual. When Gene presented his wife Ruth with the painting, she was delighted. Meanwhile, David was improving his drawing skills. Richard couldn't fall asleep. In the present, Catherine Scott asked Tilly if Matt or Sweat had given her any gifts. Tilly replied that it's against the rules, but Catherine knows for sure that the woman had received gifts from the inmates. Tilly agreed to cooperate with the police because she wanted David and Richard caught. Well, at least that's what she claimed. Richard and David are dangerous criminals, and if they resist during the arrest, the police will have to shoot. In that case, Tilly will tell her version of events, and no one will be able to refute or confirm it. Catherine understands this well. In the past, in the morning, worried Jean came to Richard's cell and said that there would be a search in 5 minutes, so he needed to hide the paints urgently. Out of old friendship, Jean helped Richard with this, allowing him to wait out the search in the technical room. Hearing voices, Richard headed forward. Could he in theory make his escape from here? A few minutes later, Jean came back for him. The guards were checking each cell for prohibited items. Thanks to Jean, Richard was clean. In the evening, Richard turned on the light and peeked into the ventilation grate. David's attention was drawn to the commotion in the adjacent cell. Then Richard asked David if there was the search under his bed. David replied no. He didn't yet understand why Richard was asking about it. Richard dreams of being free, but it's impossible because he's serving a life sentence. It was February. In the evening, the inmates were supposed to go back to their cells. Richard was drawing someone's portrait again. The guards were in control to make sure there were no skirmishes. Taking advantage of the moment, Richard approached Jean and said he seemed to have forgotten the yellow paint where he had hidden his things during the search. Jean allowed the inmate to quickly go fetch the paint. In reality, it was just a pretext to inspect the technical corridor connecting the rooms. Richard hadn't formulated an escape plan yet, but he started preparing for it. David, who had been placed in the cell with cable TV for good behavior, heard Richard's voice, enjoying the element of surprise. When guard Boyd, whom none of the inmates like, heard David talking to someone, the guy pretended to be trying to catch a cockroach. Richard emerged from the technical corridor, defiantly holding the yellow paint. Jean advised him to be careful with Boyd. Richard understands that he can't manage without an accomplice, and David is the perfect option for him. Richard shared that if they could get through the ventilation, they could descend to the basement. The problem is, it's very dark there. At first, David didn't take these words seriously, but Richard was determined. If they could get hands on a hacksaw, it would make their task easier. That morning, Tilly and her husband arrived at work at the prison as usual. The wife doesn't like the fact that Lyle often flirts with the female guard at the entrance. He expected to hear anything but that. Tilly got down to her duties, supervising the inmates' work. Richard teased David, urging him to ask Mrs. Mitchell for a flashlight. Almost immediately, Tilly told inmate Sweat to come with her to help bring some spools from the machine room. However, Tilly was interrupted by a representative from the prison administration, Joyce. It turned out someone had lodged a complaint against Tilly. The fact that she regularly went to the machine room with Sweat and returned with nothing seemed at the very least suspicious. Tilly denied everything, insisting it was slander, but the head of security, Dennis Lambert, confirmed that there were indeed dirty rumors circulating among the inmates. Tilly wasn't fired yet, but it was decided that David would no longer work here. Crying, Tilly locked herself in the restroom. Meanwhile, David was resenting the loss of his job and comfortable cell. Jean had to use force to restrain the inmate. Now David had 2 weeks to find a new job. Seeing the beautiful paintings done by David, Jean was impressed. He wanted to buy a painting, but David gave it to him for free. Jean brought the inmate to another block where he would definitely not be lonely because there was a big company here. Another inmate, Gary, was brought into David's former cell, which immediately caught Richard's attention. The newcomer quickly noted his artistic talent, but Gary didn't understand why he spent so much time on it. Richard responded rudely. In his new cell, David set traps for cockroaches and other insects. During the break, Lyle was talking to Dennis. Lyle didn't believe all the rumors about his wife, thinking that someone, either offended inmates or colleagues, just wanted to tarnish her reputation. Upon crossing paths with Joyce, Tilly expressed her outrage and demanded to have Sweat returned as her assistant. However, Joyce appointed Mr. LaBelle as the assistant. The most important thing was that they stay on schedule. During the shift, Tilly had to inform LaBelle that he had been promoted to senior. Tilly didn't even try to hide her annoyance, saying how well David had been performing compared to everyone else. LaBelle, however, was happy about his promotion anyway. Barely holding back her emotions, Tilly wrote a note to her beloved and secretly asked Richard to pass it on to him. At that moment, she couldn't hold it anymore and burst into tears. To dispel boredom, David was reading a book in his cell. One of the inmates constantly bothered him. When Richard approached, David impatiently asked that inmate to leave them alone. Richard passed the note to David as promised. Richard suggested writing a reply note, but David didn't want any more trouble. He had already lost his job and cell. Richard brought up the topic of escape again. If David continued his relationship with the supervisor, they could benefit from it. However, David still believed it was unattainable. In reality, Richard's words made him think. Tilly approached Richard to make sure he had given the note to David. Tilly hopes the beloved will reply to her. Richard assured her that David would definitely respond, but a little later. To please Tilly, Richard decided to talk to LaBelle, who was not on good terms with her. This conversation was absolutely pointless, but Richard achieved what he wanted anyway, created the appearance of standing up for Tilly. She appreciated it. Seeing a family photo, Richard started asking Tilly about her pilot son. She asked Richard if he had children. He replied that he had 2 daughters. On the way home, Lyle remarked that today was a great day. Tilly said it would have been great if not for the management. The next day, Richard secretly showed Tilly photos of his daughters. He communicates with the elder one, but hasn't spoken to the younger one for a long time because she lives in Mexico with her mother Rita. Tilly sincerely sympathized with Richard. When she left, he smiled, pleased with the impression he made. It seems Tilly fell for his charm. Lyle still refuses to acknowledge the obvious and doesn't believe the rumors about his wife's infidelity. Tilly decided to contact Richard's ex-wife Rita, posing as his friend. Tilly just wanted to say that Richard was doing well and that he missed his daughter Maria. Tilly didn't speak Spanish and wasn't sure if Rita understood her. Tilly increasingly found herself in conflicts with the management due to decreased production efficiency. Tilly claimed that LaBelle's sluggishness was to blame for everything. Seizing the moment and being alone with Richard, Tilly said she called his wife and told her how much he loved his family. Richard shook her hand, expressing his sincere gratitude. The new contingent doesn't suit David at all. It's always too noisy here, which distracts him from his creativity. Because of this, David got into a fight. Later, David complained to Richard about his unenviable plight. The good news is that David found a job in the prison library, but otherwise everything is very bad. Suddenly Richard asked David for the photo of Tilly's dogs. This request seemed strange to David, but he didn't refuse. More than anything, Richard craves freedom, and perhaps Tilly is his key to freedom. Finding out that his mother isn't going to help him, David felt disappointed. Life here was unbearable for him. Eventually this made David change his mind. Perhaps Richard's idea to escape isn't so bad after all. Anything is better than staying in this place for the rest of his days. At night, David listens to music on headphones and tries to abstract himself from what's happening. The next morning in the prison canteen, he approached Richard and said he agreed. At first Richard pretended not to understand what he was talking about, but then they shook hands. The guys don't plan to stay in this place for long. From that day on, Richard began flirting even more actively with Mrs. Mitchell and secretly gave her a gift, a drawing of her dogs. Tilly was very flattered and asked the inmate Matt to help her in the utility room. Of course it was just an excuse to be alone with her. Richard said he just wanted to thank her for helping with his daughter. Naive Tilly quickly succumbed to his charms, admitting that the husband never looks at her as a woman. Hugging Tilly, Richard said he wanted to paint a picture for her, but only by all the rules, on canvas. For this he needed tools, including hacksaws. Saying this, Richard thought that freedom was already close. March came. Tilly came to the salon to get a manicure. Infatuation with Richard seemed to give her wings. After the salon, she went to the supermarket for groceries, while Richard, to kill time, watched TV and chatted with Jean. As if casually, Richard asked the guard to transfer David back to this block because Gary supposedly behaves inadequately in the mornings. Jean promised to think about it but couldn't promise anything. Remembering Richard's request, Tilly went to the hardware store and bought everything he asked for, including metal hacksaws. Tilly didn't have enough cash with her, so she paid with a card. While life in prison went on as usual, Tilly returned home. The husband didn't even notice she had been delayed. While Lyle slept, Tilly discreetly hid the tools in the groceries. While the inmates discussed their plan, at Richard's request, Angel set fire to Gary's cell. It escalated into a strong fire, causing commotion among both the inmates and the staff. Richard's plan worked perfectly. The next morning, Tilly packed the food along with the tools in a bag. Her husband didn't suspect anything. Upon arriving at work, trying to act naturally, Tilly asked Jean to pass some groceries to Richard Matt as a thank you for helping in the machine room. Jean fulfilled the request. Someone had previously set fire to Gary's cell, but direct suspicions didn't fall on Richard because Gary wasn't liked by many. Left alone, Richard retrieved the tools from the minced meat, washed it and hid. After the repairs in the burnt cell were completed, David was transferred back here. David was impressed by Richard's cunning plan, but that's not all. When Richard showed him the tools, David realized they were closer to their goal. The guys carefully hid the tools in their cells. They can't afford to miss the only chance for freedom. Since then, trying to act as inconspicuously as possible, they began to prepare everything necessary for the upcoming escape. The top priority is to saw through the metal bars of the ventilation. While working, Tilly approached Richard and asked if he received her package. Richard replied that he had just finished working on the frame of the future painting. Once outside the prison block, David crossed paths with Tilly and her husband. They just passed by. Tilly and Richard's secret relationship continues. They were often on the brink of being caught. Tilly joked that it would be nice if something happened to Lyle. Finally, Richard finished sawing the ventilation hole. To prevent anyone from hearing suspicious sounds, David loudly coughed, diverting attention. The guys rejoiced inwardly. In the evening after work, Tilly and her husband spent time at the bar with Gene and his wife Ruth. When Gene and Tilly were alone, he told her that he found her recent request to pass groceries to Richard Matt strange. This gesture was inappropriate. At night, long after lights out, David and Richard continued preparing for the upcoming escape. Today, for the first time, they managed to sneak directly into the ventilation. Freedom was closer than ever. The guys descended below. David has been in prison for 12 years, and for the first time during this period, no one knows where he is. They explored this place for a potential exit. From here, they could access any cell or room. Right now they could eavesdrop on the guards' conversations. They also noted the time it took to pass through the tunnel. The next morning outside, they tried to figure out which hatches led through the ventilation. Tilly's secret meetings with Richard continued. She confessed that she missed David and felt guilty towards him. Contrary to her expectations, this didn't upset Richard at all. When Lyle was cleaning his area and went into the room for warm socks, he found the drawing his wife received from an inmate. Richard confessed to David about his relationship with Tilly. He also mentioned that she felt ashamed. However, David was indifferent to her feelings. Richard was too, but he saw an advantage in it. If Tilly were on their side, it would make their task easier. David agreed with Richard's idea of giving Tilly something of his own to remember him by more often. While Tilly was reprimanding LaBelle for poor work, Lyle unexpectedly entered the workshop and demanded to speak to inmate Matt. This made Tilly nervous. Lyle couldn't start the conversation for a long time, so Richard started first, lying that Tilly had asked him to paint a picture as a gift for their wedding anniversary. It sounded convincing, and Lyle felt like a fool. Richard assured him that Tilly was a decent woman. Later, Richard told Tilly about his conversation with her husband. So far they're above suspicion. Meeting Tilly outside, David said he held no grudges against her and handed her something of his own. At that moment Tilly could barely keep from crying. At night, David continued to explore the ventilation system, while Richard decided to rest. David found a ladder leading to an outside hatch. However, he was separated from freedom by a serious obstacle, a brick wall. To avoid anyone noticing his absence, David returned to his cell, taped the ventilation grate and painted over it. Of course David didn't get any sleep. At the first opportunity, he shared with Richard what he had seen at night. Richard decided they would break the brick wall. There's a toolbox downstairs. David knows how to pick locks, so there shouldn't be any problems. Richard lied to Gene Palmer, saying David wasn't feeling well. This would allow him to rest because they had a lot of work to do at night. After lights out, David picked the lock on the toolbox, and he and Richard got to work. Breaking the wall without attracting attention wasn't easy. Finally the guys managed to do it. However, there was another obstacle ahead of them in the form of a brick wall. Of course they weren't going to give up and continued to diligently break the bricks. During the day, the guys made plans for what they would do when they were free, and at night, continued to pave their way to freedom. Will concrete and metal walls stop them? Hardly. In the evening while her husband was watching a TV series, Tilly wrote a love letter to David, not shy about expressing her frank fantasies. She hopes they can meet soon. Tilly doesn't know that both her lovers have been secretly exploring the inside of the prison building at night. A thick layer of reinforced concrete separates them from freedom. Obviously they won't be able to break such a wall just like that. The guys tried to figure out their next move. Richard said that when they escape, they'll head straight to Mexico, where he knows all the ins and outs. Right now the most important thing is to ensure none of them get transferred to another cell. Since there's nothing to lose, Richard decided to take a risk and told Tilly that he and David aren't planning to stay in prison. He also directly told her that he's not using her tools to make frames for paintings. Realizing that her two beloved inmates intend to escape, Tilly was extremely excited. She would very much like to go to Mexico with both of them. The problem is that breaking the wall could take up to 5 years. Richard told Tilly not to dare tell anyone about it. Little by little the guys are breaking the wall. It's their only way out of here. Tilly didn't expect her husband to make her a margarita before bed. Lyle wanted to please his wife, but she said the cocktail tasted disgusting and refused to drink it. Lyle wanted tenderness from Tilly, but she pushed him away. Right now her mind was far from the husband. It was May. Gene arrived at work on his motorcycle. David treated calluses on his hands after the night's work. He's losing hope, thinking they'll be caught before they break that damn wall. Richard told him not to despair. Since Tilly agreed to help them, there's hope. They're lucky for the first time in their lives, so they can't afford to miss this chance. Joyce is unhappy with the productivity of the workshop. Tilly said the work would progress much faster if her best worker David hadn't been transferred. Joyce gave Tilly until Friday. Tilly couldn't hide her frustration. She can't wait for Richard and David to finally get out of here so she can reunite with them. Richard said that if she gets something else for them, the process will speed up. While everyone was working, Tilly and Richard drank alcohol from the thermos, making plans for a joint future in Mexico. Tilly would very much like that. Suddenly Dennis Lambert walked in and saw the supervisor and inmate chatting amiably. Of course they tried to pretend nothing was happening. Dennis was very displeased. At night, David was breaking down the wall again. Spotting something curious, he asked Richard to come down. It turns out that the steam turbine heating the prison block has been shut off until autumn, which means they can make a hole in it, pass through it, and then make another hole on the other side. This will take approximately 4 to 6 weeks. Richard doesn't regret taking David as his partner at all. Sure, the pipe is narrow, but at the moment there's no better option. During the day, the guys scope out the area outside to consider all the details. Dennis Lambert was transferred, and another supervising guard was assigned to his place. Richard discreetly passed a note to Tilly and asked her to do everything written in it. Richard and Tilly exchanged glances for a long time. Of course she's willing to do anything for her beloved. The new guard was more lazy and irresponsible, which worked in Richard's favor. Through the window, he watched Tilly leave the prison building and stop near the hatch. Richard wanted to assess the distance and time. Also, Richard told the new guard that Mrs. Mitchell is really trying, and the delays in work are not her fault. To ingratiate the newcomer, Tilly bought food for him. While he was busy, she and Richard discussed the escape plan. Richard told Tilly that she would wait for them near that hatch when they escape. To destroy the evidence, Richard ate the note. Hearing that the escape would take not years but just a few weeks, Tilly was very excited and scared at the same time. Lyle could be a serious obstacle for them. Richard said he needed a map of New York State and even more hacksaws. At night, David tried to saw the pipe, which was not an easy task. But it's better than trying to break through the thick concrete wall. The Mitchells were visited by the son Kenny. Lyle shared with his stepson that there are problems in his marriage with Tilly. It seems she's unhappy. Kenny didn't know what advice to give his stepfather. Their anniversary is coming up soon, and it could be a good opportunity to mend the relationship. Jean brought another delivery from Tilly to Richard and demanded explanations from him. Richard assured him that there's nothing between him and Tilly except friendship. Of course Jean didn't believe him. He also made it clear to Richard that he immediately suspected his involvement in the arson in Gary's cell. Jean was taking a big risk covering for Richard. The fact that they won't be able to rely on Jean anymore could complicate matters. Tonight David finally managed to make a hole in the pipe. However, the pipe was too narrow. David barely fit in it. Getting stuck, he panicked and began frantically climbing back. Fortunately, David was able to get out. As agreed, Tilly scanned the map of New York State for Richard and handed it to him when they were in the machine room. At one point Tilly burst into tears, saying that her bosses were unhappy with her work, and she was on the verge of being fired. Richard promised to handle it and approached the guard, telling him that LaBelle wasn't coping with his duties. For attempting resistance, LaBelle was taken to solitary confinement. The guard instructed Tilly to choose a new foreman and force the inmates to work. During the break, Tilly managed to meet with David. They only had a few words exchanged. Tilly is excited about her future life with the sweethearts in Mexico. Of course, in reality the guys have no intention of taking Tilly with them, they're just using her. They need someone with a car to pick them up after they escape from prison. Richard and David plan to lay low in West Virginia with acquaintances for a while and then head to Mexico. Of course, without Tilly. Her husband Lyle remains the main obstacle. What if he wakes up in the middle of the night, discovers his wife missing and calls the police? And they can't fully trust Tilly either. After all, she could change her mind at any moment. The guys from the workshop started threatening Richard, calling him a snitch. Tilly went to the mall to pick out a cute swimsuit for Mexico. At night, David tirelessly continues to pave the way to freedom for himself and Richard. Tilly is eagerly awaiting the moment when she can put an end to her old life. She feels like a true goddess of love. For the new life she needs a new hairstyle, so Tilly went to the beauty salon. She also started exercising to get herself in shape. Waking up in the morning, Lyle first congratulated his wife on their wedding anniversary, but she wasn't there. Lyle went to the nearest cafe to book a table for the evening. Tilly doesn't know that the guys' plans don't include taking her with them. Richard gave Tilly sleeping pills so that on the night of the escape she could mix it into Lyle's food. In the evening Lyle waited for his wife at the cafe, but she never showed up. Meanwhile, Tilly was getting drunk at the bar. She remembered the anniversary well and purposefully hid from her husband. The bartender, who knew Tilly, noticed that she had started to look much better lately. A lot of women change their appearance for the better before a divorce. Drunken Tilly openly admitted that she doesn't love Lyle and wants to leave him. Tilly returned home late and could barely stand on her feet. Naturally, Lyle, who thought his wife was working late, was upset. Tilly pretended to have forgotten about the anniversary. However, Lyle was sure that his wife had prepared a gift for him and showed her the painting drawn by Richard. Angered, Tilly shouted at the husband not to dare to rummage through her things. In the room, she pulled out 2 sleeping pills and a note from Richard, who wrote that she should take a phone with GPS, maps, rope, an axe, a shotgun and a shovel for the journey. Tilly eagerly awaited the day she would escape to Mexico. At night, David made an entrance through the other side of the pipe. Almost everything was ready for the escape. After a while in the evening, Boyd checked all the cells, making sure that the lights were turned off in each of it. When the guard left, David left his cell again through the ventilation. The fear of being discovered no longer bothered him, as it had become routine for David. Now he only thought about freedom, which was closer than ever. Opening the hatch, David found himself outside, beyond the prison building. This was inaccessible to any of the prisoners except him and Richard. Returning to the cell, David woke up Richard, and they agreed to escape the next night. Both were extremely excited. It was June 5th. In the morning, the Mitchells as usual were going to work. Tilly said she wanted a donut. Despite being late, Lyle gave in to his wife. Entering the store, Tilly bought 2 donuts and gave one to her husband. Lyle doesn't even suspect what his wife is actually thinking about. While the prison was starting its usual routine, Tilly said she was supposedly feeling hot and asked the husband to take her warm sweater to the car. During breakfast, Richard and David behaved as usual. The new security chief in the workshop, Kevin, made a remark to Tilly about her being dressed out of uniform. Tilly said it was too hot here. At the beginning of the shift, the prisoners were let into the workshop. Approaching Tilly, Richard whispered that they intend to escape today. She's very nervous about it. Certainly it will be the longest day for the 3 of them. During lunch, David asked Robert about Tilly's mood. Robert replied that she's nervous, which is quite normal. David thought that if he talked to Tilly, it would calm her down. Richard assured him that there was no cause for concern. LaBelle returned from solitary confinement and intended to kick Richard's ass. Since Richard is respected here, many prisoners were ready to stand up for him. Richard announced that a mass fight would take place tomorrow. During the afternoon in the workshop, Richard and Tilly exchanged glances often. With each passing minute, Tilly became more nervous. After a short shift before the weekend, Lyle asked his wife if she minded ordering Chinese food today. Tilly couldn't care less. She responded reluctantly to all her husband's questions. Jean entered Richard's cell and asked if he wanted to drink. Jean is here because he feels guilty about their previous conversation. Richard didn't refuse Jean's offer to drink. They talked for a while and made up, which made Jean feel relieved. Passing by Richard's cell, David noticed them together. Wishing Richard a good weekend, Jean left. Now both Richard and David need to rest properly before tonight's escape. On the way home, Tilly couldn't calm down, thinking about what awaits her tonight. At 6 o'clock, Boyd announced to all the inmates to leave their cells. David felt terribly tired, but he had to obey the rules. David believes that they shouldn't cross paths with LaBelle today, but Richard doesn't care about him. LaBelle remembers their agreement. Richard assured David that he just wants to talk. However, David was still nervous, fearing that due to Richard's injuries, they wouldn't be able to escape tonight. Outside, 2 aggressively opposed groups gathered. A fight was inevitable. The security immediately intervened. Richard and David hid, hoping to wait out this madness. The Mitchells went to a Chinese restaurant. Lyle chattered away while Tilly remained silent almost the entire time. The guards managed to stop the fight only late in the evening. There were many casualties. Neither Richard nor David were hurt, but they can't return to their cells yet. In the restaurant, Tilly ordered some alcohol. Finally, those inmates who were unhurt were allowed to return to their cells. Tilly is nervous because everything is not going according to plan. She and her husband were supposed to be home by now. When Lyle went to the bathroom to wash his hands, Tilly took out the sleeping pills. While Richard and David were heading back to their cells in the general flow, Tilly was about to mix the sleeping pills into her husband's drink. The lights were turned off in the prison block. It was 10 o'clock at night. Richard left a goodbye note saying that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life here. While Lyle was sipping his drink and chatting casually, Tilly was desperately trying to cope with her nervousness. At the same time, David and Richard were preparing for the escape. Tilly didn't even understand what Lyle was talking about. She couldn't eat, feeling her nerves breaking down. Tilly never dared to mix sleeping pills into her husband's drink. So far the guys were confident that everything was going according to plan. Tilly couldn't handle her panic anymore and told the husband she was having a heart attack. Lyle urgently took his wife to the hospital. While the guys were running down the corridor, the emergency room doctor examined Tilly. She was in a panic, not understanding what was happening to her. The guys followed the plan precisely. David left a funny drawing on the tunnel wall. The doctor said they needed to wait for the test results, and in the meantime, Tilly would be given a sedative. The guys left plenty of drawings, as if mocking all the prison staff. After that, they climbed through the pipe. Richard found it very difficult to move in such a narrow space. It's almost midnight, and Tilly's panic is growing. By now she should have been waiting for her lovers by the hatch. The nurse put her on a sedative drip. As the guys made their way to the hatch leading to freedom, Tilly slowly fell asleep. Finally, for the first time in many years, the guys found themselves outside the prison grounds. Of course Tilly wasn't there. Richard and David were very nervous and disoriented. They had already forgotten what life on the outside was like. Obviously they had two options left, either go back, calm Tilly down and try to escape again in a week, or head for the mountains. Richard suggested stealing a car, but David said it was a bad idea because every car had GPS installed. Now their only option was to go to the mountains, wait there for a few weeks and then head to Canada. They couldn't go to Mexico because Tilly might turn them in. The guys were the first to successfully escape in 86 years. They had 5 hours before the guards noticed their absence. The guys smoked and walked forward, barely holding back hysterical laughter. Next events take us many years into the past. All state police received an announcement about a recent model pickup truck wanted in connection with a pyrotechnics store robbery. 3 white men were heading north. A sheriff's deputy patrolling the area got out of his car for 5 minutes to buy groceries. Then he resumed his patrol and noticed a car breaking traffic rules. The officer asked the violators for their documents. It was a father and daughter. The girl named Nicole was driving for the first time. The officer politely explained that they shouldn't be driving at night before taking license exams and wished them luck. Soon the sheriff's deputy found trash on the road, which the dispatcher had informed him about earlier. The officer did what was necessary according to the instructions and briefly stopped by home, where his wife was waiting for him. She said her sister was bringing her new boyfriend to their upcoming party. Overall everything was as usual. The policeman continued patrolling the streets and saw a pickup truck and several guys on the road. When the officer got out of the car, one of the guys fired several shots. David Sweat was also present. Another one of his buddies fired twice. It was the 4th of July, 2002. On December 3, 1997, Richard Matt broke into the home of an elderly man, his former employer, with the intention of robbing him. William Rickerson said there was no cash in his house, so Richard attacked him. Richard stole everything valuable from the house and fled with his accomplice. Richard, by the way, had previously served time in prison and had recently been released on parole. The guys arrived at a wasteland. Mr. Rickerson was in the trunk the whole time. Richard demanded that he tell them where the money was. Mr. Rickerson kept saying he didn't have any money. The guys drove on, not intending to let their hostage go. Soon 2 familiar girls got into their car, looking for good company. Ordering his partner to open the trunk, Richard showed the girls what was inside. After that, they hurried to leave. The guys drove again and stopped at a vacant lot. Richard still demanded money from Mr. Rickerson. The injured man, barely conscious, said he had $27,000 in savings. Mr. Rickerson begged to be released and swore he wouldn't tell anyone. However, the guys knew it was a lie and decided to intimidate him, but went too far. In the end, Mr. Rickerson passed away, which wasn't part of the guys' plan. They left the body, and Richard went home to his wife Rita. Later, Richard returned to the scene of the crime to dispose of all the evidence. By morning Richard had fled. Tilly lived a normal family life and had no idea that 20 years later her fate would be intertwined with 2 extremely dangerous prisoners. It was August 14, 1993. Tilly's first husband, Kenny, believed she should quit her job to be constantly with their son, Kenny Jr. However, Tilly didn't want to leave her job. An unremarkable guy named Lyle constantly looked at her. Kenny and Tilly worked in a sewing shop. Tilly complained to her colleague Janet that she was tired of her marriage and wanted to spice up her life. Tilly and Lyle were lovers and met secretly from her husband. Soon Kenny caught his wife cheating. This was not Tilly's first affair. She felt no guilt, shouting that everyone has the right to make mistakes. Kenny in turn yelled that he would never give her their son. By the way, it was Janet who turned Tilly in. That's how her marriage fell apart. She cried, fearing that Kenny would carry out his threat and take their son away. Lyle also has a wife, Norma, but she still has no clue about her husband's infidelity. Tearfully, Tilly begged Lyle to leave his wife as soon as possible. Lyle couldn't refuse Tilly, who intended to prove in court that her husband had a tendency for aggressive outbursts. Perhaps this would help her gain custody of the son. Tilly returned to work with her head held high and interacted with Janet as if nothing had happened. Kenny didn't say a word to his wife. Lyle openly gloated, forcing Kenny to punch him. In fact, he deliberately provoked Kenny so that it would happen in front of witnesses. Meanwhile, Kenny is living in a cheap motel. Tilly got what she wanted and gained custody of the son. Kenny never wanted to see the woman who ruined his life again. Tilly explained to her son that Lyle would now be his new dad. The boy was very upset. But Tilly didn't care because she always only thought about herself. In the present, Richard and David are hiding in the mountains. They were exhausted, but they couldn't stop because the police were searching for them everywhere. Hearing a helicopter, the guys hurried to hide. The area is being patrolled by police officers. Governor Andrew Cuomo arrived to speak personally with the prison warden. It was the first day of the escape. The governor inspected the inmates' cells. It was obvious that the guys had carefully planned their escape. Catherine Scott, the state's chief inspector, came to the gym where one of the prison wardens, Josh Armbruster, who was officially on sick leave, was working out. Catherine accused him of insurance fraud, but that's not why she was here. Learning that Catherine had been in contact with the governor the whole time, Josh became really nervous. The doctor told Tilly that her tests were normal, so she could go home. Tilly hoped that the events of the past few weeks were just a nightmare. Lyle came to pick up his wife, who looked irritated. In the car, Tilly received dozens of messages on her phone. Lyle was surprised to see helicopters. There were many police cars in town. When urgent news started broadcasting on the radio, Tilly immediately turned it off. Near their home, Detective Phil Osley was already waiting for the Mitchells. He was questioning all the prison staff. Trying to remain calm, Tilly said that neither Richard Matt nor David Sweat had ever behaved suspiciously. Lyle was shocked, not understanding how it was possible to escape from prison at all. The detective said that the police were currently investigating any leads. Before leaving, Phil Osley left the couple his calling card. Meanwhile, experts were examining the hatch through which the inmates escaped. Catherine senses that they are overlooking something. The governor and Catherine again arrived at the administrative building of the prison. They both believed that someone helped the escapees. Lyle was following the news on TV. They were visited by Kenny and his wife, as well as Dennis Lambert. Tilly tried to appear indifferent. Lyle asked his wife for a private conversation. He believes they should tell the police about the painting drawn by Richard Matt. Tilly reacted aggressively to this idea. Lyle doesn't understand what could have caused such a reaction. Richard and David continued to move forward through the mountain forest until it got dark. They were about 30 miles from Canada. Right now the guys needed rest. It rained the next morning. The guys covered their tracks so that no one would see that they had set up a small camp here. When Tilly went to the store to buy food, Lyle went with her and brought a gun because it might not be safe on the streets now. Seeing the detective, Tilly approached him and decided to confess that she had given a photo to one of the inmates for drawing. But Tilly assured that she hadn't given Richard anything else. At home, Tilly hastily unpacked the suitcase she had packed earlier for Mexico and threw away all the belongings. Gene Palmer destroyed all the paintings Richard had given him. Meanwhile, David and his accomplice continue to make their way through the forest. Their strength is leaving them. Seeing a cabin, Richard suggested stopping there. David thought it was a bad idea, but Richard didn't care. He felt too exhausted. There was no one in the cabin. While Richard rested, David explored the cabin for anything useful and found alcohol. Richard opened the bottle without hesitation and offered it to David, but he prudently declined. Catherine questioned Gene Palmer, asking about the mincemeat given to inmate Matt. Gene confirmed that Joyce Mitchell had indeed passed the mincemeat to Richard. Gene has no idea why Tilly needed this. Catherine immediately suspected that something was wrong here, and she was right. In the evening Tilly was cooking dinner. Lyle wanted a little tenderness from his wife, but his persistence only irritated her. Suddenly a police car arrived at their house. Tilly knew immediately that it was over for her. The detective was persistently knocking on the door. Lyle told the police that they couldn't enter without a warrant, but Phil Osley has a warrant for Tilly's arrest. This story instantly caused a sensation in the press. Waiting for interrogation, Tilly cried, realizing that there was enough evidence against her. Catherine came to ask her a few questions. Meanwhile, the police were combing the forests in search of the escaped prisoners. Contrary to David's warnings, Richard drank water from dirty springs. This caused Richard to have a stomach upset. In the cabin, turning on the satellite-operated television, the guys heard that the police were searching for them in the forests of Vermont, which was completely the wrong direction. Richard thought they could relax. The guys also learned about Tilly's arrest. Richard said she got what she deserved. Because of her, their escape could have been ruined. The guys had dinner and spent the whole evening watching the news on television. All channels were talking only about them. It is assumed that Richard gave prison guard Gina Palmer paintings in exchange for tools, although this was far from the truth. David claimed he wasn't the one who took the deputy sheriff's life. Richard also claimed he was innocent. His accomplice just made a deal with the cops. By the way, today is David's birthday. He turned 35. Richard jokingly apologized for not buying a gift. They agreed to continue their journey at dawn, but that didn't stop Richard from getting drunk. He disregarded other precautions, which irritated David. He found a gun and decided to keep it secret from Richard, who continued to drink. In the morning it was time to hit the road. Richard found a rifle and noticed David's gun. Richard planned to ambush someone on the road and steal a car. This would allow them to quickly reach Canada. David didn't like this plan. The owner of the cabin returned with his dog and took out his gun, immediately realizing that someone had been here. At this time the guys ran as fast as they could. Lyle and Kenny refused to believe that Tilly had an affair with two prisoners at once. This is written in all newspapers. Kenny met with his mother and told her that they wouldn't be able to post bail. Neither of them has that kind of money. This finally broke Tilly. Kenny said that Lyle doesn't believe any of the rumors about her. However, Lyle can't calmly leave the house because he's instantly surrounded by journalists. Kenny directly asked his mother if all those rumors about her were true. David and Richard continue their journey through the mountain forest. David takes care to sweep away all the tracks, unlike Richard, who is more careless about everything. They found some abandoned cabin and checked it out. Richard kept talking incessantly. He knew from the start that Tilly wouldn't come. Her facial expressions and gestures indicated that. David asked his partner to shut up and walk, otherwise they could be discovered at any moment. However, these words had no effect. Richard was too drunk and couldn't walk further. This made David very angry. They were so close to their goal, but could lose everything because of Richard. It was the 20th day of their escape. Near the road the guys heard voices. There was a police car on the shoulder. Richard thought it was their chance. However, a shootout with the cops was not part of David's plan, so he ran back into the forest. Richard didn't have time to do anything, as the police left anyway. David ran through the forest as fast as he could, while Richard searched for him everywhere. By evening David was far enough away, but still afraid to stop. So Richard was left without his partner. He went back to the road and lay down right on the roadway, but then disappeared into the bushes. Richard didn't have any plan at all. Seeing a cabin, Richard threw a bottle into it to make sure no one was there. It was here that he decided to spend the night. At night, Richard drew with charcoal in the dim light. Was this the freedom he had dreamed of? Every sound made Richard scared. In doing so he'd get drunk again. In the past before prison, he also had problems with alcohol. It was the 21st day of their escape. Richard hid in the bushes near the road and shot at a passing pickup truck with a van, damaging the tire. When Richard shot again, the driver hurried to get away from there. Richard returned to the cabin with nothing. Despite the fact that the driver could inform the police at any moment, Richard did not run. He didn't even run when he heard the sounds of engines. Of course it was the police. Richard realized he could lose the freedom he had long sought and tried to escape through the forest unnoticed. In addition to cars and a helicopter, there were plenty of people with weapons. The tactical team was preparing for a raid and entered the forest. Richard felt unwell and was constantly coughing, which gave him away. He hid behind a tree. When the SWAT team surrounded him, Richard pulled out his rifle and was immediately neutralized. He passed away on the spot. David is still on the run. On the radio he heard that Richard perished while trying to resist. Yesterday he turned 49. David feels guilty and knows that the police are pursuing him. He won't be able to hide forever. Nevertheless, the next day, David made it to the Canadian border. A police car stopped near him. David ran, shouting that he was unarmed. He couldn't give up his freedom. The police officer had to shoot. After the second shot, David fell. He was wounded and taken into custody. Thus ended the long chase for the two fugitives. David was brought to the hospital in critical condition. When he felt better, Catherine Scott interrogated him. Initially there was a theory that Richard took David's life in the woods. David denied this version, saying he left Richard to save himself. Catherine does not hide her admiration for the prisoner's escape plan. They really pulled off a perfect escape, but they couldn't stay free for long. David is very sorry that Richard perished. They were friends. November has come. Tilly was allowed to see her husband. She faces 3 to 7 years in prison. Lyle is taking it very hard. He always guessed that his wife was unfaithful to him. Tilly said she was sorry. Lyle could no longer hold back his emotions. He's not sure he'll wait for the wife to come out of prison. Tomorrow is the trial, and Tilly is preparing to make a confession. 51-year-old Tilly sincerely regrets assisting Sweat and Matt's escape and considers it the biggest mistake of her life. It affected her family's life, but nothing can be changed now. What happened to the real heroes of this story? Joyce Mitchell was sentenced to prison for aiding the fugitives. Gene Palmer was found guilty of moving contraband into prison, although he was unaware of the escape plan. After serving his sentence, he moved and changed his name. Lyle Mitchell remained living in the same place and is waiting for his wife's release from prison, regularly visiting her. David Sweat was transferred to another prison and is under constant surveillance. Before the escape, Richard Matt sent some of his drawings to his daughter. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.